Throughout history, there have been many horrible things people have invented to hurt other people. Whether you were seeking information on traitors, wanted a public execution as a show of force, or simply as a means of deterring criminals, there was a baffling array of torture devices for the job. Hello time travelers, I'm your friend Mike Brady, and here are 5 truly terrifying torture devices from history. Mongol trampling platform. In the 13th century, the Mongol invasion was in full swing. They were laying waste to all the lands between Asia and Europe. There was a curious law of the Mongol religion that was causing them trouble. Of course, they had no difficulty in defeating their enemies on the battlefield, that wasn't the problem, but it was against their religion to spill the blood of any noble or king. Now, this didn't mean they weren't going to leave them alive, of course, but it did mean they had to find creative workarounds every time. Now, this could involve drowning, strangling, or beatings. Just so long as they didn't bleed, the requirements of the religion were satisfied. Pretty grim stuff. In 1223, after a particularly devastating victory against the Eastern European Kievan Rus, the Mongol armies under the command of generals Jebei and Subutai captured a huge number of the enemy's nobility. The Mongol commanders decided to host a party to celebrate their victory, and they would be singing and dancing and feasting for all the soldiers of the Mongol army. It sounds like a great time. So to host this vast celebration, they had a large wooden platform like a stage built, and in order to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak, the Mongols decided to combine their victory celebration with a mass execution of the captured nobles. They strapped the nobles beneath the platform and then held their feast on top of it. They ate, drank, sang and danced atop the platform that was being held up by the bodies of the Rus princes, and of course they were all crushed to death over the course of the celebrations. I'm starting to think these Mongols weren't very nice guys. The Mongols delighted in finding creative ways to execute their enemies, and the crushing of the Kievan Rus is one example of their creative religious workarounds. But of course, there were many, many more. We'll revisit the Mongols another day in more detail, but in the meantime, let's flash back in time to ancient Sicily and the tyrannical king Phalaris. The Brazen Bull. If being trampled to death isn't your style, what about being cooked alive? Well, the Brazen Bull was a device built in the 6th century BCE for Phalaris, the king of Akragas, which is now modern-day Sicily. The bull was designed for the execution of criminals. In order to discourage them from committing petty crimes, executions in this period were designed to be as gruesome as possible, and they were often held in full view of the general public. The Brazen Bull was built by an Athenian inventor called Perilos, who had carefully crafted the bull to make death as slow and as loud as possible. The device was a full-size statue of a bull, hollow on the inside and built out of bronze. With a door on the side of the bull's body, an unfortunate prisoner could be stuffed inside the statue and then have the door locked behind them. And after this, a fire would be lit underneath the bronze body of the bull, and the temperature would slowly rise inside until it was hot enough to cook whoever was inside to death. To make the spectacle all the more gruesome, Perilos had designed a series of pipes and horns that connected from the prisoner's position inside the body to the bull's mouth, so the screams of the prisoner would come out warped, made all the louder by the design of the tubes. And when a prisoner was being burnt alive, the sound apparently resembled that of a bellowing bull. As the legend goes, when the inventor Perilos first presented the bull to King Phalaris, the king was intrigued enough to want to see the torture device in action. So he ordered that Perilos be the first one to be tortured. He stuffed him into the bull. For a while, Perilos screamed inside the bull, and just as he was on the verge of death, Phalaris had him taken out. The king was satisfied that the device would work as intended, but if Perilos was expecting a reward, he would be sorely disappointed, because rather than pay the man for his work, Phalaris had the badly burnt inventor thrown from a cliff to his death. After this, the bull was used on serious criminals who'd committed treason. But the Mad King may have lived to regret commissioning the horrible invention, because according to legend again, King Phalaris himself was overthrown and executed through burning in the brazen bull. The bull's story didn't end there though. In later centuries, the device would be taken by the Romans and used to execute Christians and Jews that had rebelled against Roman rule as late as 287 AD. The rack. This is an infamous device that we've all heard of. The rack dates to the medieval age and was mostly used for the torture of traitors and so-called heretics. Various designs of this device exist, but it was perhaps most famously used in Spain during the years of the bloody Spanish Inquisition, when it was used to torture those supposed heretics. The rack is a fairly simple machine, really. A prisoner would be strapped onto a flat table, raised off the ground, and then have their limbs tied by ropes to axles that run across the head and the foot of the table. So the torturer would then insert a piece of wood into these axles, using it to rotate the wheels and pull the rope tightly, and slowly the prisoner's limbs were stretched in opposite directions to each other. So depending on the severity of the crimes and the length of time that it would take to get a confession, many joints might be dislocated before the torture would end. The hips, knees, shoulder and elbows were all in danger of dislocating under torture on the rack, and some muscle tendons were even stretched so far that they couldn't contract. This torture could take place over many hours and leave its victims permanently disfigured. Protestant preacher and poet Anne Askew was tortured on the rack for heresy in the 1540s and was left so badly damaged that she had to be carried to her execution because her limbs had been dislocated. Now, using the rack as a restraint also allowed other tortures to take place. The victim could be cut or burnt while held in place in the rack with no way of defending themselves from the torturer. The Spanish Inquisition in particular made use of cords attached to the rack and wrapped around the limbs of a person undergoing torture, so when the ropes were pulled tight, the cords wrapped around the limbs would also tighten, cutting into the victim's flesh all the way down to the bone. John Custos was a Portuguese Freemason who was tortured by the Inquisition in 1743. He was subjected to the rack 3 times over the course of months, each time being grievously wounded, before being healed back to health by his captors so that the torture could just begin all over again. Despite the reputation the rack has as a medieval method of torture, it was used as late as the 18th century in some parts of the world, and the practice was only outlawed in Britain in 1708, and in some places lasted way longer. Breaking on the wheel. Now, the method of breaking on the wheel was popular across Europe, particularly in the 18th century, where it was done publicly as a deterrent to other criminals. And the watching crowd could even get involved. Great, who doesn't like crowd participation? It was probably modelled after an earlier Frankish execution, in which someone was placed beneath a cart and repeatedly run over until they died. Creative. The later torture device was often little more than the wheel of a cart, or if time was short, some crude pieces of wood could be nailed together into the rough shape of a wheel. And the prisoner would be tied to the wheel, while the executioner, armed with a club, hammer away at their victim's arms and leg were broken before delivering a final blow to the stomach. The actual length that this torture would go on for could vary depending on who the torturer was and how strong the person being beaten was. In 1761, a French man accused of strangling his son was beaten on the wheel for more than 2 hours before he died. His torturers were attempting to extract from him who his accomplices might have been. Now, other times, someone was simply beaten until they gave up whatever information a torturer was seeking and then let go. In some cases, breaking on the wheel was just a way of killing a prisoner in a gruesome and public way. There are also multiple ways to perform the torture that could be adopted to local conditions. The Germans liked to beat a person until their spine broke, and then they would weave their body through the spokes of the wheel and then string the wheel up. This would then leave the person unable to move, and they would die of exposure. It's horrible. Humanity's capacity for cruelty truly knows no bounds. The boot. The boot has had a few variations, but they all centered on achieving the same results. Unsurprisingly, from the name, this focused on a victim's foot. It involved placing the victim's foot in a wooden or in some cases metal boot. And from here, there were two options. The boot could either be screwed tighter and tighter against the victim's foot until the bones within began to crack and split. Some places also used the method of driving a wedge into the boot with a hammer, which would also cause the boot to contract and snap the victim's bones. Or in some cases, the boot could be used to submerge a victim's foot in boiling liquid. In England, a metal version of the boot was made of riveted iron, and once the boot was on, boiling oil was poured into the device, completely submerging the foot and cooking it inside the iron. Sometimes the boot would be filled with cold water and then slowly boiled over a flame. This brutal form of torture had its origins in the medieval period, but it was used up until the 17th century in some places. The French, meanwhile, used a similar sort of boot, though theirs was usually made of leather. These boots would be drawn over a prisoner's legs and feet, and then submerged in boiling water. The leather would absorb the liquid and cook the person's flesh on the inside. Unlike other methods of torture, the boot was not intended for public executions and instead functioned solely as a means of extracting confessions from prisoners. It's easy to feel thankful that none of these devices are, well, to our knowledge, in use anywhere in the world today, but unfortunately, even though laws have been signed that outlaw the use of torture on prisoners, it still happens behind closed doors. People may not be being cooked alive inside of bronze bulls, but some of the world's governments still make use of terrible, creative ways of extracting information from victims. Remember, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly echoes. Hello time travelers, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly echoes.